Welcome everyone to the Mindset Podcast, where each episode we explore how embracing adversity can help lead to positive change. A little over 6 years ago, I got sober from alcohol and drug addiction, and what I learned during that period of time was how the biggest or smallest challenges in my life paved the way for the most positive and enriching period of growth and learning I've ever experienced. FRP is a people-focused firm, both with our excellent teams internally and the clients we work with day to day. Like many other professional service firms, we give particular attention to delivering the best advice for people under what can often be extremely stressful situations. So it follows, spending the time understanding how we can learn and grow from any periods of adversity we face will also see us evolve and grow as individuals and better serve our clients. This podcast aims to provide inspiration for others trying to progress in their careers, help professionals feel less isolated on their journey, and to debunk the myth that we all have to be all right all of the time. Most importantly, we want to walk the walk of change and integrity with the experience of others who have walked the path before us. Challenges can be used for good. I absolutely believe this fact. I hope you enjoy. Thank you for being the first person to come on the podcast and supporting us in kind of launching it. I guess in terms of background as to what you're doing at the moment, so as we just talked about, you're at Passel, you're a VP there in terms of looking at sales. You've recently moved to DC to try and pick up things in the States. Anything you would add to that in terms of what you're currently doing, what you're looking at, and what your day-to-day is?
Gosh, probably not a huge amount, just very fortunate that, as we'll get into during the conversation, my background was sport, and that all came to an end fairly suddenly, and you then move into something entirely different, and it's taken me on this journey where I'm now here, well, I say here, I'm here in London at the moment, but over in DC experiencing something entirely new, and it's an amazing opportunity and fundamentally something that I really love. So yeah, really lucky to be working at Passel in that position and dealing with great people both internally and externally. So yeah, it's been a cool journey so far.
Awesome. So as we've talked about, the whole concept is overcoming challenges, looking at growth. So I guess an interesting starting point is perhaps you can share some of what your challenge has been and your main kind of learnings that have derived from that. That's quite a broad question, but effectively a kind of version of the journey.
Yeah, of course. So I guess kind of for context, for it all to start to make a little bit of sense, I was really fortunate that after graduating university, went on to play professional rugby. Did that for around about 5 years, and as you can imagine, it was the most incredible experience. Something you kind of dream of doing as a young boy, and you grow up and all of a sudden realise that journey may end up reaching kind of, I suppose, the pinnacle of professional sport, and it did, and it was incredible. But then it all kind of came to an end through injury. Sadly, I had to retire due to concussion. And then all of a sudden, your world's flipped upside down. Everything that you know and you love just sort of disappears overnight. So then you kind of go on this journey of like, where am I going? What am I doing? And that's been really, really interesting for me. And I think the big takeaway from it was that, if I consider to where I've got to now, is that there is, I suppose there's a path set out for you. I'm a big believer in that sort of manifestation and positivity, and actually there are things that happen for a reason. You don't necessarily understand why they happen. With all of that, I think you can maybe sort of guide that path, but you definitely can't control it. And I think that's what I've really taken away from that journey to getting to where I am now.
And so does that translate in your day-to-day life now with a new tool or a new skill that enables you to hold things a bit more loosely or enable things to... So for example, when I look at what causes me kind of friction in my day-to-day life or in my career, often it's the need to control things, people. Why aren't outcomes coming the way I want them to come? And then how can I respond better and not react? And I wonder if you're, to your point around there's a path there and you get to control some things on the way. Do you feel like that's something that's stayed with you in what you're doing now, or do you feel like that's just enabled you to put that journey to peace so you're not sort of living in resentment over not being able to play sport?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the reality of all of that is that I don't think I'll ever truly get over the fact that it all came to an end.
Right.
As I kind of mentioned there, it's everything you know and you love, and not that you should ever define yourself by anything, but like I was Ali the rugby guy, like that's how my family knew me, that's how my friends knew me, and then it's gone. And all of a sudden you're kind of in the wilderness going, what am I doing? Where am I going? Who am I? and it's kind of working out what can you do moving forward to make sure that that's right. So are there tools that I've been able to sort of pick up along the way? I don't necessarily know if there kind of were, but I do think like one of the things for me was having that really positive mindset initially kind of helped me to just move forward with everything and actually start to plan out what are the next steps going to look like. And then around that, and I'm sure there's something you've considered, but that you start sort of thinking about some of that goal setting and those sorts of things, and how can I do this moving forward, and what's the next step on that journey. So yeah, those are probably two of the big things that helped me along moving through that transitional period, I suppose.
Yeah. And was it Wasps you played for?
Yeah.
5 years at Wasps.
Not 5 years. I wish it was 5 years at
right.
Wasps. I was actually in their academy growing up. Sadly, didn't get the contract. Went off to university, and then ended up signing professionally for Plymouth Albion in the Championship, and kind of went on the journey from there. But my final year was playing at Wasps.
Okay, so that was a bit of a full circle moment.
It was a full circle moment. They're the team that my family and I had always supported. You know, I used to go down to Adams Park at West Wickham, watching them play. You know, Lawrence Delalio, James Haskell, these are the guys you're kind of like, wow, look at them play. And they're heroes. And James Haskell, Danny Cipriani, these guys were coming through early on. And then on that full circle moment, I ended up finishing my career being involved with Wasps when they went to the Prem final against Exeter. I say like the likes of Danny Cipriani was back at the club, James Haskell. And like to be in and around that environment was absolutely incredible. Like I was never the starter. I just was fortunate enough to be a part of something that I suppose on a personal level meant a huge amount. But in terms of, I suppose, career, it was a huge achievement and something that, you know, can't be taken away from you.
And how old were you when you played your last game?
27, 28, around then. So kind of in many ways going into my prime, and I would have hoped to have had many more years playing. And that's why I think on that whole idea of, I don't know if I ever fully get over the fact that it got taken away from me, because you can't control that moment.
No.
And I think probably most people in any career, but particularly sports, think that they're going to kind of play out that final game, the last hurrah, and they know what the next steps are going to be. And for me, it just went and it was gone. And you're kind of working out what those next steps would be, and you have the whole emotional element of it as well. And like I would, you know, I've been really lucky. I've lived a fairly fortunate and privileged life, but it was, I guess, a form of grief and something that was really tricky to kind of come to terms with, that that's not you anymore.
And do you mind me asking what the injury, did you, when you got in, what the injury was, and when you got injured, did you have a feeling, were you like, this isn't going to be good for me, or was it a delayed piece of news that you then kind of, you know, when did the hope of playing kind of get removed, I guess?
I think what was happening was I was getting these issues with the concussion outside of rugby. Like I hadn't had a concussion, and I was getting all of these sort of concussive symptoms. I mean, if you look at the list of what they are, it's, you know, an A4 piece of paper sort of worth. But, you know, it was things like just not feeling right, headache, sensitivity sort of to noise and light, sort of generally feeling a little bit unwell. And I think with all of that, you're going, right, well, I haven't had a concussion. Why is this all happening? So I went along to see the specialist, who I'd seen a couple of times from other head knocks, and he was like, look, basically what's happening is your brain is giving you a full warning as to what's to come. It might be a little knock tomorrow, it could be a big knock in a couple of weeks' time. I can't give you sort of a definitive answer on that. However, if you don't stop playing, you end up having permanent issues. And very sadly, I do know one or two guys who have been through that, and it's devastating. I know the reality is that there are probably a few things that I notice now, and I imagine as you sort of deteriorate with old age, that a few other things will crop in. But ultimately, I'm able to lead and live a life that I absolutely love. It's just without the sport. And
when you were going through that period of sort of seeing doctors and the reality of you not being able to play start to sink in, did it feel like a grieving process for you in terms of, you know, did you get emotional and angry, and then, you know, how did that play out, and what would you say was the first time that you realised you were starting to accept the outcome?
I think going into the initial conversation with the professor, the consultant, I knew, I had a feeling it would go the way that it went. So I think I kind of prepared myself for it. Then off the back of that, I think I'll be honest, it just set in immediately.
Right.
I remember just sitting in my car, pretty sort of emotionless almost, like just devoid of, I just couldn't really process things. And then, you know, give it another 24 hours, even when I think I maybe got home, and then I just started bawling my eyes out whenever you start to think about the fact that actually the thing that you love and you've done since you were like a wee whippersnapper running around the field playing like grassroots stuff, it was like, yeah, that moment's completely gone, and it really did set in as I guess a form of grief, of like a loss of something that was so close to you. And as I say, not you should ever define yourself by something, but I was Ali the rugby guy, as I said earlier, and it's like, wow, okay, now this is gone, what on earth am I going to do? And I remember standing in front of, you know, a group of, you know, guys and essentially colleagues, like players, and I was crying, delivering the news, and, you know, and that's when people start to obviously rally around you. But it is all a personal journey of kind of overcoming everything, I suppose.
And how long do you think it was that you were in that period of acceptance before you felt light enough to go, okay, what's next?
I think it took a little while, to be perfectly honest. I think you initially are thinking, what am I going to do with myself? Like, yes, I've had an education, I've done this professional sports, and I think the thing with sport as well is you're always moving on to the next thing, you're always trying to attain the next thing, and all of a sudden that's gone. So you're like, okay, I need to set this goal of what the next thing is going to look like, what it's going to be, but you really are in the wilderness. And I didn't know what I wanted to do. Like, I'd studied sport management at university because I thought, you know, sort of business sport would be very interesting. I was lucky to have done the sport itself. And then I was like, well, I don't know whether that's what I want to go into. So what direction is life now going to lead? And I do think it probably took, in reality, maybe 3, 4, even 6 months for me to actually be like, okay, life really now needs to kick on. I need a job.
Yes.
I need to be doing something that's entirely different, and I can't just keep living. I was in a rut, really, if I'm being perfectly honest.
Of course,
like, and if you look back at the time, like, I never did it or anything like that. But I'm sure if I went and spoke to, you know, be it a psychologist, a doctor, or someone, and explained maybe what I was feeling, what I was going through, they probably would have been like, yeah, you know, you're suffering probably from some form of depression at the time.
Yeah.
Despite that positive mindset, you're a bit like, you're just lost.
Exactly, yeah. And the reality of life, of course, is when you're going through something for the first time, and especially in your case, you're talking about sport, high level, elite level of sport, you're socialised into the world as a sportsman. That's who you are, as you're saying. Let's be honest, a lot of your friendship group will be based around your sports relationships. A lot of the respect you would have received and felt would have been based around, you know, and then all of a sudden that's gone. It's like, well, you know, I mean, it would have taken some people a number of years, I'm sure, to get over, because, you know, it's really, really difficult. So it makes perfect sense what you're saying.
Yeah.
And I guess I think with that, I think that's really kind of insightful as to the journey in, you know, and the low point, the kind of rock bottom, if you like, of that experience, you know, afterwards, and being devastated, and the fact that it kicked in quite quickly. There's the kind of light of some people rallying around you,
100%.
And then there's the bit of you just working through the emotion, because we're human, we don't get to skip that bit. We unfortunately have to go through it before we can. So, and then I guess, what would you say was the start of the beginning, the start of the new chapter? Was there anything that was a catalyst, or that you went, okay, I'm now off in this direction, I moved, you know, you felt like you'd moved forward?
I think maybe like the thing I wanted to pick up on before answering that was like your element of like hitting that rock bottom, is that I mentioned it earlier, but I do think there's an element that it sort of stays with you. And it's interesting, actually, I was at a wedding over the weekend, and a good friend of mine who was there, he actually went through a similar-ish process to me. He had played professional rugby, and it kind of came to an end, and he's had 1 or 2 other things happen in his life recently that have been quite hard. And you're there, you know, having a deep kind of conversation, and he kind of opened up. He was like, I'll be honest, he's like, I've never admitted this to anyone, but like, I've never been able to let go of the rugby, and I think it still holds me. And I was like, I completely agree with you. You know, it's 3-4 years on now, and it still sits there in your mind. Like, you see players that you played with kicking on, doing really well, or you want to go and play sort of National 1, National 2, whatever it is, local rugby, and you know that you can't do it. So I do think that, you know, despite moving forward in life and so much coming from it, it always kind of sits there in the background.
And what you're saying is, of course, so true, because it forms a new part of your identity, and it actually goes back to the point we were discussing before about there's a choice there. Yeah. And the choice is like, okay, well, how can I move past the sense of resentment or self-pity, which invariably is going to stay with you, because it's unfair. It's completely unfair. You know, you've landed back at Wasps after going on that journey. You're about to hit your peak, and it's like, what do you mean I can't play anymore? You know, and then how am I meant to just accept that? And then it's a case of going, and actually, for example, that conversation, you would have been the only person in that room that would have been able to have the conversation with the person you were having it with, and probably quite helpful for the person you were having it with. So that's where it gets harnessed for good, if you like.
It's funny because he said that, he's like, no one else here, like, despite being really close friends, are able to have this conversation. Like, no one's done what we've done. And it's like, yeah, it is. It's, you know, we're very fortunate to be in a very small percentage who did it, and then go through what you did. And people do rally around you and they support you. Obviously, you've got family, you've got friends, and all those sorts of things. And actually, how did I go from basically being in the wilderness? And I was just like applying for jobs blindly, thinking like, right, what are the things that I like? I like people. I like being able to engage with them. I want something that's going to stimulate me intellectually. Like, let's just fire out the CV to jobs that seem like they're relationship-based jobs. And I just had no idea where I was going. And then I was really lucky that a very good family friend of ours actually turned around to my mum and was like, look, I've sort of seen what's happening with Ali. Would love to actually sit down with him and have a bit of a conversation. So I came into Leithway, had a couple of sort of what I thought were just conversations. Reality is they were probably sort of interviews. Had some great conversations there, and then they offered me a role. And that was a turning point. That was suddenly like, oh, okay, like I'm being, one, pulled out of this rut, and two, stuff that I am talking about has clearly resonated with people in the sense of, and I'm sure we'll come on to it, like there's so much that you get from sport that you can actually give into the world, be that both personally but actually in a professional sense. There's loads of transferable skills. And I think because I'd sat down maybe in some of that time and tried to work some of that out, I was able to put that across in an articulate manner, and that's been well received. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, I've got a job offer in City. Like, that's cool. Now I'm moving on to the next thing. And all of a sudden that kind of, maybe that weight's been on your shoulders does start to dissipate more, because you're like, okay, the next step is here. That next goal, which was get a job, has been achieved. So now onwards and upwards.
And there's a lot to be said for from my experience, and the people I know, often we refer to it as smart feet. You know, don't think, just take the action. You know, with action comes change. And again, much easier said than done, but of course what happens is there's like a new data point. That new data point is you're sat having a conversation with someone, and then you walk away feeling validated and accepted, and then it's like, well, actually I've got another skill set here that I can use and harness, which I didn't actually know I had until I sat myself in front of this person and had the conversation. And then you're walking home with different data in your head, you know.
100%.
But you don't know that until you've used your feet to take 100%. The action, you know. And that's what's so interesting about it. And I guess on that, what would you say were your biggest fears during that 3, 4, 5 month period when you're trying to think about moving on to the next thing? And perhaps more interestingly, did any of those fears actually become true for you?
It's a great question. The reality, like, it's amazing doing the professional sport, but unlike everyone else who goes through, I did the university because my dad was always like, you know, you've had a good education, make the most of it. You never know what's going to happen, which is obviously slightly ironic that it ended up going the way that it did. But, you know, the typical process is you finish university, if you've gone through university, or you finish school and you start work. And at that point you are on, the reality is, a corporate ladder, and you're starting to move up and move forward and all of this. Whereas in the sport, you're moving forward in that, but you're not moving forward in like a career aspect, if that makes any sense, because it's such a world away. So my big things that I was really worried about was like, how far behind am I? Like, I'm essentially 27, 28. Everyone else is either, you know, somewhere probably between the ages of 18 and 21 starting those first jobs. And they've got 5, 6 years ahead of me. Will I actually be able to make any form of success for myself? Like, how am I going to be able to do that? And also, as you said about that data point of validation, it was like, what do I actually have to offer? And I was lucky as I suppose finally had that interview. You sit down, you go, right, what is there that I can offer? And that's where that whole idea of going, bloody hell, there's loads of really good transferable skills here. I just need to work out how I can articulate that. But there were genuine fears of like, am I going to be able to, how far behind everyone am I going to be, and like, will I ever like make a success of myself? Am I going to be basically validated in it? And those were real, and they sat with me, and they probably sat with me when I first got into the work as well. Have any of them come true? No. I don't think so. I think there's still an element at times of like that imposter syndrome, where you're like, oh, like even if things are kind of going well around you, you're like, well, I've lost one thing before, I could lose it again, or like, is this all kind of, it's not, is it real? But I can't believe that it's moving in the way that it is after everything that I went through. But I think the main thing is that the reality is you're always going to have those fears, but the nice thing is that they haven't really materialized quite in the same way that you might expect.
And I think that's I think it's a huge lesson, like for all of us really, in terms of when we're looking at how we can move forward or evolve in any manner. And actually there's an argument, not even an argument, a kind of fact-based theory around we're in our optimum kind of growth stage when we're moving into that fear, that slight uncomfortableness. And again, you can use it in a sports analogy where if you're training at the gym, when you're in that top 5%, that's where your cardio is improving, or your strength. And it's the same for career and life, I think. And what's interesting is, as you've just said, and I'm sure if you ask this question of 50 other people, the answer would be my fears were X, but none of them came true, because it's all self-centered, it's all in the mind, right? And it's and I think the reason that's a really useful thing to hear is because it removes some of the impact that fear can have. And then of course, because we're human, imposter syndrome massively. I still get that all the time. I sit there and I think, these people think I'm an adult because I don't feel like an adult. It's but that's part of the process, I guess. And it's I think that's really interesting. It doesn't remove the challenge from my experience. I think as you've alluded to, the fears kick back in different formats, and then there's different ways to kind of approach it, I guess. And actually that leads nicely on to the next question, which was around, when you look back at what you've learned during that period of time, what would you say are some of the big things that you applied to your life today, and that have helped you and perhaps helped others that you find yourself being of use to others as a result as well?
Yes, it's really interesting. Actually, it's going to be probably like a bit of a boring answer because it's quite like pragmatic in terms of what it is. But like, there are, I mentioned it before, but there's like these great transferable skills that you get through playing professional sport and that you can use elsewhere. And like, I think if I take the first one, because it became, I suppose, quite evident to me when I first landed at Leithwaite, was the ability to, I suppose, it's not just deal with people, but have conversations with people in a slightly different manner. When you're playing professional sport, you have the opportunity to, engage with some, I suppose, fairly senior individuals, whether that's people involved with the club, or you've got sponsors, or just people coming to do corporate stuff, and you have those great conversations. But you're also talking to guys on a day-to-day basis who have either got different backgrounds to you, people respond to things in a different way. And I remember when I first got to Leithwaite, some of the kind of other, what was I, an associate or whatever, associates, senior associates being like, oh, I can't believe you speak to the partners a bit like they're your friend. I'm like, well, yeah, but they're just like another human being. Like, obviously you want to be conscious of the fact that they are the senior partner and they have this role and there's that corporate element and all of that, but equally they are just another person, and you can sit there and you can talk to them about the sport on the weekend, or the theatre that they went to see last night, or what their daughter's doing this weekend. Like, you can have those normal conversations and not have the fear of it. So I think that was one thing that kind of really resonated. But then when you start to like break it down, leadership is one that, like, I've never necessarily considered myself a leader, but that is something that you just naturally learn huge amounts about when you're playing sport, just because you see what's good from a leadership perspective, but you also learn to do it yourself. Like, you learn that actually some people are very happy for you to be very direct to them and that communication style. Other people, they need that kind of hand holding, being a little bit more soft, I suppose, around it. And that again really translates into the working place. And again, if I think about that, I remember listening to Benjamin Kaiser. I don't know if you know who he is, but he used to play professional rugby for Leicester in France, and he did his MBA at Oxford, and he was on a podcast and he was talking about, what a great experience that's been. But he spoke about that, they had a whole module on leadership, and he was like, I can't believe people pay money for this. Like the amount that I already knew going into this, when it's suddenly broken down into an academic way. That coachability, the ability to adapt, pressure, being able to deal with pressure. You find loads of coping mechanisms that you can then take into the workplace. I think that whole idea of like team first, being able to understand like how to make the most, you can have a couple of great individuals, but you're never greater than the sum of your parts, and that's what makes for success, and that's no different to business. And I think like, another thing would be like, honesty. One of the things that struck me is how people aren't always honest in the business place, I think, in various different lights. Be that your colleagues or obviously clients and prospects and all these sorts of things. And actually, you're much better off putting your hand up and going, either I got it wrong, or like this is what my thoughts are, than harboring those thoughts. So there were loads there that I could probably go on and on about it, but it's one of the topics that I quite enjoy talking about. I've got into enjoying doing some mentoring and helping people in different lights, and if I ever talk to anyone who's done professional sport and considering what are the next things, that's one of the things I'll sit down and break down, is like, right, this is what you did and this is how you translate it into a business aspect, and that's how you can articulate it so that people understand why leadership on the field translates to leadership here, or coachability, or coping mechanisms through pressure, and these sorts of things. Like it all resonates. It's just a question of articulating it the right way.
And the irony of it is, actually, you'll be far better placed than the majority of the workforce at the start of your career, when you did start your new career, with all of those things, because there's so much that is learned there. And possibly one of the biggest things I would argue is that teamwork. The ability to understand, and I'm still fascinated by it all the time now. And actually, I use it. When I say I use it, what I'm referring to is like the sports analogy of a team working together to better improve my performance in my role as a director here. Because it's so easy to, so for example, your point around dishonesty, well, often that derives from a requirement to want to push forward yourself, or some kind of fear around something. And it's so easy to stay looking after oneself rather than the bigger picture. And I think where, like, I feel super inspired is listening to certain sports teams who are in their kind of flow state, or in their gelling period. Usually it's like, if I look at football, usually whoever wins the Premier League, they go through a period of cohesion, and you can tell by the way they talk about each other, they're a team. They if there's one person who's not performing for a particular period of time, they're not really talking about themselves, they're still talking about the team, because they're so as a group. And that's a really powerful thing, of course it is, and applying that to the work world is a huge challenge. And again, it's its own separate industry, really, isn't it? So I suspect there's a lot there that naturally meant that you took off. And would you say there were things that there were traits that you kind of took from that 3-4 month low period, and then the transitioning back? Were there tools, were there new skills, were there things that you've carried forward which you think, you know what, I'm really grateful I actually had that experience now, because it means that I can do X, Y, or Z?
I think the big thing for me, and I mentioned it earlier a little bit, was the positive mindset. I think being able to look at things in a positive light makes everything so much better. And I think it's so easy in today's age to like find yourself bogged down with various different negative thoughts, and social media can be an absolute killer, and all of these sorts of different things. But actually, by looking at things in a very positive light and taking the positive spin on things, it just helps you to sort of see the light, so to speak, and therefore you can kind of do that moving forward. And if I look at what I'm doing now, like I'm in a sales role, which is I guess actually probably very good for somebody who's done sport, because ultimately it's quite competitive in terms of you can be very competitive with yourself, and there's an element of competition around those around you, but it's still about being positive. Things might look like they're going slightly sideways, but what's the positives that you can take from this, or what are the learnings? And I'm sure that, I don't know how much you're going to share around your story, but I'm sure if you consider everything that you went through and you really did hit a rock bottom, that if you look at it in a different light, that there's probably some positives that have come from it that you implement now, I imagine.
Yeah. I mean, I'd say, you know, ironically, that it was all positive, you know, in many ways, because, you know, I read something the other day actually where I can't remember who it was that quoted it, but it said the quote had said something like, "I'm convinced every person needs to be stripped of everything before they truly find themselves." You know, and that's not new, that kind of analogy, but it's very true. And in my situation, that was definitely the case, because and again, it's comparable to yours, because they're relative in terms of that sense of low. But what we don't know at the time, when we're in that time of crisis or particularly low point, where we may feel completely isolated and like we're the only ones in the world going through that, it's the start of the beginning. It's the start of something new that we otherwise would not have had. You know, that only occurs because of the result of the situation. Yeah. And then, of course, when you move out of that, you go, wow, I'm really grateful for that. And in my case, it's enabled me to be the person I've always wanted to be, but wasn't able to be, you know. And it kind of permeates into all aspects of my day-to-day life and business as well. So it's a huge thing. And I suspect also in your situation, and I'm not saying you didn't carry humility before, but you would have got a greater sense of humility, a greater sense of, I am penetrable, I am flawed, I am someone who can't control outcome, as you've already discussed, which again makes you probably more malleable moving forward, which is a really key thing to take.
I agree. And I think it's so important to recognise like how fortunate you are to have experienced what you have, and actually you say there's that humility to it of like, Christ, like I went through something that I never thought I'd go through, and it was a really difficult period of my life, but you end up, you know, coming out the other side in a really positive manner, and being able to say help that kick on as the new chapter. And I think the other thing, like with something that I probably learned, I think it came more from sport, but then during that time of lost in the wilderness, so to speak, I probably recognised it and I use it now. And you know, I'm sure if I spoke to a psychologist or a counsellor, they might not say it's a good thing, but the idea of like compartmentalisation, because in sport, like you're performing to, you know, go out on the weekend and play whoever it is, so you have that week's build up to it, do that, and whatever the result, you essentially box it away and move on to the next one. Yes, you do the analysis and stuff, but you know, by Tuesday you're on to what the next game is. And I think for me, again, like when I look at it on like an emotional level, and like what I do now is being able to recognize like you're not going to be able to control everything. There's certain things that are going to happen, but it's kind of being able to box that away, understand that sits here, and move on to the next thing, but still being able to kind of come back to recognizing, okay, so that happened, and what does that mean? And I don't know whether that's something that you've experienced,
or it's interesting,
because it can be seen as a very negative, as like you should never box something away and all these sorts of things. But actually, I personally find being able to kind of park that and not necessarily put the emotional attachment to something or whatever it might be has been quite maybe beneficial in terms of the way that I approach work. I think.
And I think it's interesting hearing you say that, because it's not something I tend to do, and it's something I tend to do the opposite. Like how I've gotten better is and how I stay well is to be open and connect. But having said that, there is definitely a place for what you're describing. Of course there is, because ultimately you're functioning, and the balance, which is obviously always the key, isn't it, is the balancing bit. It is as you say, being able to compartmentalize some of those things, but also visit them.
Yeah, exactly.
To understand they don't, so they're not weights around your ankles, but they become, you know, actual more tools in the toolbox. And definitely in terms of work, I mean, it's a whole skill set in itself to be able to navigate, you know, especially with what we do. We deal with lots of stakeholders, you know, lots of people who are emotional, lots of people who are frustrated, and being able to navigate people and emotions is a big part of what we do. And it's something I always give myself a really hard time for, because I'm an emotional person. I feel emotions. So the ability to be able to go, okay, that's just that. That person doesn't mean this personally, and let's put that there back on the shelf and move on with my day, is a huge thing. And that's kind of what you're alluding to. So it's definitely a skill set in itself.
Do you find, you know, with the nature of what you do, you say there are people at some of they'll be in quite low places, you know, the whole restructuring element, etc. And do you, when you approach it, do you kind of come with that open mindset of going, I am an emotional being. I want to be able to have those proper conversations with people. And do you do that? And will you kind of almost park the work and have conversations with people that may be opening them up in a different way and using some of what you've been through for that from a work perspective? Or do you try and compartmentalize the two and actually go, I'm just approaching this in a work sense right now?
Yeah. And again, I'm smiling because it's interesting. Whilst I've said I don't do it, I definitely do it actually without thinking. Yeah, I think it's judged on the situation. So what's most helpful to the person at that time? Is it actually they just want someone to deal with the situation and they don't want to pay homage or spend time to what's going on emotionally? Or is it that actually they need to have that human element and to have that touch point? And we always go out of our way to try and make it a personal experience, not a clinical one. But there is definitely a time and a place to just be job at hand. Let's focus on that. But also go, look, this is clearly not a comfortable time. Oftentimes, what we're trying to achieve is make the best of a bad situation as well. So there can be a positive spin on it.
Yeah, certainly.
So I guess in closing, is there anything you've got going on in your career, in your life at the moment, that's kind of the next step, the next challenge, and is there anything you're trying to implement to assist that, or are you kind of in a positive space and happy with what's going on?
It's interesting. I mean, I was thinking about this the other day. I like the idea of goal setting. I think it's really important to know what you're trying to strive to achieve. But I also think the reality is you can impact the day that you wake up. I think you can have an impact there. You can probably have an impact on that week, maybe 2 weeks out. But the reality is you can't control what's happening, 3-4 weeks down the line. You kind of have to let life play its way out. And that kind of comes back to what I was saying at the very start, that there is going to be a path for you, which there's elements of that you can guide, but you can't control it all. So, in terms of where I am at the moment, I count myself as incredibly lucky. I absolutely love the job that I have, which, I never really expected would be the case. If I'm being really honest, I never thought I would find something I love comparable to playing rugby. Wow. And what I do now, I genuinely wake up every day excited to go and do it. I've got some great colleagues. I interact with amazing people. I have autonomy around what I'm doing. It's fully plays into what I love, which is just meeting interesting people, having great conversations. So I suppose to answer that question, I am just enjoying the process. I really am. Like, living in the US, it's an amazing experience, and that alone, I'm getting to drive the company forward. I'm able to sort of drive myself forward, and again, it's that growth mindset, which again is something that you probably pick up through sport as well, but I think actually people get it in so many different lights. It's just not don't necessarily recognize that they have a growth mindset, and it's like the ability to take on new things and try new challenges and see what there is. And it's good. Like, I feel like life's in a really nice place, if I'm being perfectly honest.
It sounds like there's another saying that take the next best step. Stop, pause, consider, and then just take the next best step. And I often try and remind myself of that when my mind's going crazy and it's like, well, I want to do this, this, and this. What's going to happen here, here, and here? You can't control the ultimate outcome. It's the future. Why don't you just let go of that and go, well, what's the next best move? And the next best move could be something as simple as, I'm going to go to the meeting and I'm going to turn up on time.
100%.
But what happens as a result of that is you're now where you are today, compared to rewind 4 years ago after you just find out you can't play sport. It's like, well, you're not thinking you're going to be saying what you're saying, and it's a very obvious thing to say, but it's a really important thing, because it's a super useful tool which can be applied time and time again. And it's like, 100%. I didn't learn that until I was 31. It's a really basic concept. It's like, how do you build a house? You put one brick on first, and then you.
It is every step forward, and I have no doubt that in the conversations to follow that you'll have with people, that there'll be a commonality that probably after however many conversations that starts to come through, and a lot of that I reckon will come of that whole idea of almost like one step in front of the other, because it is, and there's always that opportunity to move forward, and the doors will open, and that there is a great life to be led. And I feel, as I say, I recognise I'm very, very lucky to be able to say that, but it's certainly it hasn't been without its challenges, and I'm now where I am, and very, very happy and feel very privileged to be able to do that.
Awesome. Great stuff.